I'm Kate Daniels. We are living in a highly critical time. You know this without my saying it. This morning, we're going to discuss it because we need to understand our need and the need of every citizen in this country to exercise our right to cast a vote. The election is less than 2 months away. To energize and inspire us is Richard Bell, a New York City attorney who has used his skills pro bono to protect voters at the polls. We'll do this in the context of his new book, Voting, the Ultimate Act of Resistance. Richard Bell, good morning. It is really so wonderful and such an honor to have you join us this morning. So good morning.
Good morning, Kate, and thank you so much for inviting me.
This is such a key, important conversation at this time. Here we are, just less than 2 months now to the election. So the opportunity to talk about the voting, what's gone on, what we need to do, and all kind of wrapped up in the context of your new book, Voting, the Ultimate Act of Resistance. A very intriguing title.
Thank you.
So here we are. Yes, less than 2 months to go. And this is a very critical time, isn't it? So that hopefully we are registered, but if a person is not or they're questioning it, there's still time to get that accomplished.
Yes, and Kate, what has to be remembered is that every state has its own rules, its own deadlines, its own procedures. So my suggestion to everyone in your audience is to go to this nonpartisan website called Voteorg, because it will spell out state by state all of the requirements, so all people in your audience can make sure they're complying with all the procedures and laws that are necessary. And my 3 rules of voting: early, early, early.
And I haven't always abided by that for whatever reason, because we have mail-in ballots here, so it's so simple. But this year, I am really getting that message loud and clear. As soon as that ballot arrives, it's getting marked and back in the mail. Because, I mean, there's so many issues around it, saying I'm putting it in the mail. The mail is an issue.
Oh, Kate, it couldn't be more of an issue presently, and you saw the Postmaster General dance around when speaking to Congress. So this is what I would say to people. Number one, I want to say unequivocally, I have complete faith in our election system. And despite a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of mischaracterization, I think we're going to have a fair and free election with one proviso. The voters have their responsibility here. And one of it is because of this slowdown at the post office and whether or not it's going to be corrected on time. In many states, at the latest, some states have your ballot has to be received by Election Day or postmarked by Election Day. No one should get anywhere near there. Do what you do, Kate. You get your ballot. You return it immediately. You check it 3 times to make sure that everywhere is signed where it's supposed to be. Everything is filled out. But most important, now, of course, Washington is a wonderful state because you have a universal vote by mail. Not all states have that. So what I think is necessary is if you feel in any way uncomfortable, if you're approaching a few weeks before election, you don't have to go through the post office. You can, in most states, return it to your local Board of Elections in person. Some states you can bring it to early voting polling sites. That's why you need to have a plan and have it early.
Precisely. And we are fortunate also in that we have so many mail voting drop-off boxes. Many of the public libraries have it right on site. And people, even in these days when the libraries are closed, there's still drive-up service. So we can get to that drop-off box. And as you say, at our county offices, we certainly in this state are not lacking, I believe.
No, Washington is obviously a leader with 4 other states in the universal mail-in. The drop boxes, that's a great thing to mention. Not all states have it, but now a good number of states have it, and that's another convenient way to do it. There's just so many alternatives for voters to make sure they get their vote in time and counted, that there's absolutely no excuse.
And it serves us, as you were saying, check it over a number of times to make sure everything is, those T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, etc.
Yes, Kate, because when mail-in ballots have been rejected around the country, there's basically two reasons. One is the late arrival, which we just spoke about. The other is some kind of mistake on the form, either a missing signature or a non-matching signature, and that's devastating because you think you've done everything right, and if your ballot is not counted, that is an absolute travesty. Now, in approximately 20 states, and maybe 21 because there was a court ruling in New Jersey yesterday, those states will notify you if your mail-in ballot has been rejected and give you a time to cure it. But there's almost 30 states that won't do that. That's why you must check it 3 times.
You know, the thing that really stuns me, and actually I'm an immigrant, so I've from Canada. I've only been able to vote for the last 20 years. And so I realize the privilege that I have and the importance of it. So to find that there are these kind of issues where people are trying to thwart that, to do all they can to prevent us. Well, here we have mail-in, so it's not an issue. But where people have to go in person, that there's that limitation and long lines, it just feels so wrong.
Oh, and it is, Kate, and my book follows my journey where I am on the ground and at the polls or in the courtroom fighting voter suppression. And when you read these stories, you realize this is not some academic study. This is me on the ground telling what really happens to voters and when they do in-person voting. And it makes you realize, number one, why voting is the ultimate act of resistance, because if it wasn't, there wouldn't be one party so intent on limiting it. I always say to people, we live in an age when shopping online is easy and voting is made hard, and that should never be in a democracy.
That is mind-boggling, isn't it?
It is. It is mind-boggling to me. And when I first started doing this almost 16 years ago, it was so alarming to me that people would come to a polling place and some poll worker would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't see you in the book, go home. And, of course, my job was to say, no, don't go home. We have things that we can possibly do here today. And what was most worrisome, which was whether I was in Ohio or New Jersey or Pennsylvania or Florida, it was always beyond disproportionately voters of color who were affected. I'm talking about more than 90% in my own experience, and it was very alarming, but unfortunately not surprising based on our history of voter suppression.
And would you say that the voter suppression goes back to the time a couple hundred years?
Yes. So what happens is when the get into Reconstruction, and we now have the right to vote for African Americans, well, that's when Jim Crow starts, and that's when the ex-felon voting laws start, and as time goes on, the poll taxes and the literacy tests. This is such a long history in America, and I would say the last 40 years, it's clearly been a political strategy, because it's no coincidence that there are forces out there that are trying to get people on one side of the voting ledger not to vote. And especially when our own Supreme Court in 2013 struck down a section of the Voting Rights Act, which required, these were mostly southern states with a couple exceptions, required that those states go before the Attorney General's office or a court for what's called pre-clearance if they were going to do anything changing voting laws. And the Supreme Court essentially said, Well, we don't need this anymore. It's kind of a post-racial society. Well, nothing could be more wrong in the last 7 years because it didn't take a day before those states started enacting ID laws and closing down polling stations and things of that nature. And it has been a very tough uphill fight in the last 7 years, especially.
And that is why two things. It is so important when we do have this privilege that we do exercise that right and do it as soon as we can. And in the meantime, your book, Voting, The Ultimate Act of Resistance, is this opportunity to see more of that history. And I think that during these times, we, with all of the unrest we're seeing, that this is a time when we need to learn more of our history and really become more informed and enlightened.
Yes, I couldn't agree more because we have these dual challenges at the moment. Obviously, a horrible pandemic. We have racial inequality reawakening. And the focus has rightly, for a number of months, been on step one, which are protests and marches and race consciousness. I want people now to move on to step two, which is the focus of my book, which is voting. Because I know and I believe to my core that voting turns anger into action and ideas into law. And we need to go from rage to engage because then everything else has been for naught.
That is a great phrase, rage to engage. And if we can funnel all of that energy, because there is a lot of it, into action, I mean, what a change, a positive change we can create.
Yes, because, Kate, let's look at examples from the last few months. Why did it take, in a liberal state like New York, where I am, why did it take until 2020 for these 10 police reforms that have been talked about forever? Why? Because there's an election coming up, there's an angry populace, and the legislators and the governor seem to be able to do it quite quickly. And why in Richmond, Virginia, did it take until July of this year to take down Confederate statues by the government, or Mississippi after 120 years changing its flag? Because public sentiment had changed dramatically, and elections are coming up. It shows you that what Martin Luther King Jr. once said, voting is the foundation stone for political action. We have these three examples in the last few months.
And I'm hoping and praying that really we're getting that. Sometimes, do you feel that that real message is being lost because the rage is there and keeps, in a way, becoming greater?
Sure. So, Kate, I kind of look at myself as, I call myself a realistic Pollyanna. So the realistic side of me says, it doesn't get across to everyone. But the Pollyanna side of me says, wait a second, this is a moment. And if we just keep getting out that message to everyone, you want change, you are the change. And the only way that change really happens over time is by voting in the kind of people that are going to effectuate your change in policy and law. Because in the end, it's not about talk, it's about action. And action in a democratic society is policy and law. And I hope most of all the young people that have done the protesting and marching and race consciousness and all these wonderful things, they need to understand you have to do step two, which is voting. And I hope that message, I know a lot of people are talking about it. Now the voters, it's up to the people to do it.
And I guess that there's a place where this is optimistic.